welcome to the first in a number of tutorials designed to show you how to convert XNA based games over to the MonoGame platform. In this particular set of tutorials we're going to go through using Android specifically. We might do some other tutorials regarding iPhone development or Linux development at a future date, but in this particular bunch of tutorials we're going to concentrate on Android. We're going to start off really easily, and we're just going to convert over a very simple XNA 2D sample that we can get from AppHub, which is the graphics 2D sample for XNA 4. For this tutorial you're going to need to get a copy of this. You'll also need the latest development branch of the MonoGame, which you can get from GitHub, and in this particular setup I'm going to be using Visual Studio Express Windows Phone 7 development environment and MonoDevelop, principally because I don't have Visual Studio Professional installed on this particular machine. You can do exactly the same as I'm going to do with Visual Studio Professional, providing you've got the Professional or above version. The Express version do not support the Android based tools, so if you don't have the Professional or above, you will need to use MonoDevelop. So let's get started. Okay, so I've downloaded the sample onto my desktop and extracted it. As you can see, we've got the Windows Phone 7 solution there. I've also downloaded MonoGame and extracted it into a directory called MonoGame on my desktop. You'll notice you have projects and solutions for each of the platforms, so we've got Android, iOS, Linux, macOS and Windows. In this particular set of tutorials obviously we're just going to be using Android stuff. So before we actually get started, let's go and have a quick look and see how it's supposed to look when you run it on the Windows Phone 7. So this might take a while to actually run up. So what we'll probably do is while the emulator is firing up, we'll pause the video and then come back to it when it's running. Okay, and there is the sample running. So if we'll just switch it into landscape mode, we can see there's a bunch of tests that it's doing. They're doing sprite and bitmap fonts, scaling, rotations, translations and an animated sprite. So now we've got that running in Windows Phone 7, we'll go about converting it over to Android. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is fire up MonoDevelop. For those of you that don't know, MonoDevelop is a free IDE that you can use for developing .NET applications on Windows, Mac and Linux. So the next step is to create a new Android project. So we'll create a new Mono for Android application. We'll drop it into the same directory as our existing application. So, and then we'll create a new project. Right, the first thing to do is to add the MonoGame libraries. There's currently 2 libraries that you need to add. The first is the networking library. You need to add that even if you're not using networking, and because it's a dependency. The second one is the actual MonoGame framework itself, so there's the Android project for that. So we'll add those in, just make sure they build. Next thing to do is to add references to those projects to our main application, as well as OpenTK, which is the way we get access to OpenGL on the Android platform. So now that those are added and it's building okay, next thing to do is to add the assets. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a new folder under assets called content. Now you've got a couple of options when dealing with assets. The first is to add your physical asset or content from the content directory. So you could add things like the PNG files directly into your application. The other option, a far more efficient one, is to make use of the XNB files that the XNA framework already created for you. You can grab these from your build directory, the content directory in your build directory. So we're just going to we'll use these because it's a much more efficient way of using the assets. So we'll just add all these in. You'll probably want to link to these assets rather than to copy them over. That way when you build your Windows Phone 7-year-old game, you can always guarantee you're going to grab the latest versions of the files. The next step is to tell the Android system that these are actually assets. By default, when you add anything in, the build action will be set to nothing. So what we need to do is change it over to Android asset, and I always like to change it over to copy if new as well. So we need to do that for each and every one of these assets we've just added in. It's going to take a while, so what we'll do is we'll pause recording and we'll come back when that's done. Right, now the assets. Now the assets are all done. Let's start looking at the game files. In this particular sample application, there's only two game files we actually need to worry about. There's the animation.cs and the actual game file itself. So we only need to add those two. If you've got a more complex project, then you'll need to add all of those in as well, obviously. So we'll just add those in. Once again, what we'll do is we'll link to the original file, so if we do make any changes, those will be reflected when we actually make the changes, and they'll be automatically reflected in the other project. So the next thing to do is to go and modify the activity here. By default, we have a button on the screen, and that responds to clicks. We don't actually need any of that for the MonoGame project. First thing we need to do is derive from an Android game activity, which is a MonoGame specific activity, and that handles some of the orientation things that we need to do automatically, so that the developer doesn't have to worry about them. The next thing to do is to set a static property on the game class, which is the activity property, to this activity. This is so that we can handle things like assets and various other bits and pieces under the hood. So in this particular case, we want to look at the sample graphics 2D game activity equals this, and now what we want to do is create a new game. The next step is to set the content view to the g.window. This is the actual game window itself, which is the OpenGL window. That just makes sure the content is rendered, and then we can just do g.run. That should compile. Although it looks like we're missing a namespace for LinkU, or link as it's properly known, so let's just add that in. It's going to be this one here. That's actually highlighted something that we need to be careful of. You'll notice that this bunch of code, we're actually using the content manager to load things like sprites and other assets, but this is actually loading a document manually from the content directory, which won't actually exist under Android. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to add some extra code in to make sure that this will work correctly under the Android system. So the first thing we'll need to do is to add a conditional, or define a conditional symbol. So let's put Android in there, and do that for the release project as well. So we can now change this. So if we do if Android else. So what we'll need to do is actually load this document from the asset system. So what we need to do is declare the system XML X document. And then we'll need to load the stream manually from the asset system. Okay. So by using activity assets, that will ensure that we're looking in the correct directory, and it will also, because we've still got content in there, it will look in this content directory and it should find the appropriate document. So let's just give that a compile, make sure it works, and now we're ready to test it on the emulator. Okay, so we're ready to debug the application now. So if we just debug, first thing we're going to get is a select device dialog. I haven't got a device running at the moment, so what we'll do is I'm just going to select a device and get that started. It does take a while to start up, so we'll pause the recording and come back once that has started. Okay, now the emulator is up and running. We'll proceed, so we'll just open up, activate the emulator, select it. Okay, this will now deploy the application to the device. The very first time you run up any Mono application on a device, be it a live device or an emulator, it will need to install the Mono framework, so there is a delay while that happens, but this only happens once. So once that's done, deployments are pretty quick after that. So that's deployed. The application is beginning to load up. Another point to note is that the emulator is very slow when it deals with graphics. The OpenGL system is software emulated, it's not hardware emulated, unlike the Windows Phone application where it's hardware emulation, I think. So you will notice a significant decrease in performance when you're running your games, as you can see. So if we just fire up the Windows emulator again and just run up the same demo, there we can see them both running. Obviously the Windows Phone one is actually running a lot quicker, but running this on an actual device is just as quick. It seems to be just as quick anyway. Okay, so that is the conversion process of a very simple XNA based Windows Phone 7 application over to Android.